by the Center for Arab Islamic Studies, and we're really, I'm honored to have a friend of mine, someone who I spent a lot of time talking with, from 2004 till 2006, not every day, but we spoke quite a bit after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, here as an author. But before we start, a couple things. Housekeeping. One, we do have food. Two, anyone's interested, two things: Arab Islamic Studies courses and brochure for our programs in the fall. We urge you to look at them and take them. These are very important times, and these are very important courses. And I gave this a lot out to my students, but if anyone's interested, we have a really innovative, interesting course that involves a trip to Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, December 26th to January 10th. It's gonna, if anyone talks or has an opportunity to talk to someone who went on the previous trips that we did, and I do it with my colleague Lowell Gustafson there, who is the director of the Center for Arab Islamic Studies. These are fabulous trips, and you not only have a good time, you really learn a lot. So, and you also get credit, so you can't go wrong. We're gonna, again, for me it's very important that Stephan Salisbury speaks today, because we are in a very interesting time. If you remember, just a week ago, there were these, I think a week ago today, was the hearings on the loyalty of the Islamic community in America. I don't know if that's what they were called, but they were basically, that's in essence what they were. The Representative King had a congressional hearing where they talked about whether the Islamic community or the Muslim community in America is loyal. And I find that troubling. But I think it's interesting, because I think we've developed a new boogeyman, and that's Islam in the United States. If anyone remembers reading the papers, it really started en masse last spring with the Park 51, or the Ground Zero Mosque, quote unquote, the Park 51 project. The number of organized groups and people coming out to protest mosques throughout the country, from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, to Sheepshead Bay, New York. Every mosque that's being proposed in the United States has opposition. And again, to me that's troubling, because I find that that's not what my America is. But it's important to know, and it's important to realize where we are in the United States. And Stephan Salisbury, I think, wrote a really interesting and provocative book about events that happened in Philadelphia after 9/11, and the suffering and intricacies that happened in the Arab and Muslim community that I was part of, and I'm actually quoted in the book. So buy the book, and it's going to be available for sale. It's only $25, and you get a signature from the author. He'll sign it for you. It's going to be worth a lot of money eventually. But if you have a chance, buy it. But I'd like to take this time. You don't want to listen to me. You want to listen to Stephan Salisbury. And I'll be quick. Stephan Salisbury is a senior cultural writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He has been a reporter for 3 decades and won numerous awards, including a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in 1995, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for the TMI reporting?
1980
with 1980 for TMI, which is kind of back in the news.
Ironic.
How ironic with the nuclear meltdown. So, right, who wants to be in Japan now? But with no further ado, Stephan, please. I'd like to invite you up here and to talk about your book and talk about the situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank Marwan and the folks at the Arab Islamic Center for having me out here. This is going to be a very informal talk. So as I ramble on about one thing or another, I really urge everyone, if a question comes up, if I say something that you find is unclear, or you want me to illuminate a little bit further, do not hesitate. Just say, hey, Stephan, what do you mean by that? Or, you know, I'd like you to go into that in a little bit more detail, because it's not clear what it is you're saying. So, as I say, this is very informal, and don't worry, I'm not going to read all this. I did want to, I was looking around today. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear my cell phone? There was a politician who was giving a speech before hundreds of people, a very formal speech. It may have been Newt Gingrich. And in the middle of his speech, his cell phone rang. And unlike myself, I turned it off. He picked it up and had a lengthy conversation in the middle of the speech, then said goodbye, closed the cell phone, put it in his pocket, and continued on with the speech. Anyway, I was actually looking around for something, some other conspiracy-related comment, and I came across this. I read it to Marwan earlier. I came across this absolutely wonderful quote, and I won't tell you where it's from, but it's very pertinent to what we're going to talk about a little bit today. It was delivered by a senator. That'll be the one clue I give you. And it was delivered on the floor of the Senate. And it began, "How can we account for our present situation unless we believe that men high in this government are concerting to deliver us to disaster? This must be the product of a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. A conspiracy of infamy so black that when it is finally exposed, its principles shall be forever deserving of the maledictions of all honest men." Now, we're going to put a little bit different spin on that today, but that was Joe McCarthy in his inaugural speech in 1951 that really launched the worst part of the Cold War era in the early 50s that he gave his name to. We have a threat here now. It's dire. The enemy is here. But it's not as though we are defenseless. There are at least 17 states that have introduced legislative efforts to ban Sharia law. We're talking about states like Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alaska, Arizona, on, Wyoming, Texas, South Dakota. Now, South Dakota, I want to pause for a second. As part of their legislative effort to ban Sharia law, they singled out specifically a prohibition on beheading. And in the debate in the state legislature, it was pointed out that beheading actually already was illegal in South Dakota, so it really wasn't necessary to add it to their ban on Sharia. Alabama lifted its definition of Sharia, which is pretty vague, directly from Wikipedia. Florida, Mississippi, Utah. Now, the one state that received a certain amount of publicity back in October, November was Oklahoma, which put a measure on the ballot to change the state constitution to ban Sharia. It passed with over 70% of the vote in November. There are somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Muslims in Oklahoma, which has a population of about 4 million people. That ban has been, of course, blocked by the courts, and it's currently being adjudicated. But what we see here, 17 states, that's really quite remarkable. A large number of people in this country are convinced that America faces a treasonous threat, that the threat can come from anywhere, and that Sharia is a vehicle for something that the vast right-wing publicity machine has termed stealth jihad. But what is Sharia? Information is in a very, very short supply on the far right. But what passes for information is extremely vivid. Sharia seems to involve, as I say, beheadings. It involves things like genital mutilation. It sanctions forced child marriages, rape, oppression of women. Very complicated. But fortunately, we have a vast number, increasing probably daily, of experts who are willing to elucidate the nuances, if you will, of Sharia. And I want to focus in particular on one of those guys who has been in the forefront of the anti-Sharia movement over the last several years, but has not really does not have the name recognition of some of the more prominent people like Newt Gingrich or Robert Spencer or Pamela Geller or other people who've now been relegated to hate group status by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And this is a guy named Frank Gaffney. He's really one of the leading voices on the far right. He's actually admitted on television that he's no expert on Sharia, but a lack of expertise is not a ban on opinions, and Frank is full of opinions. He testified in a Tennessee court hearing last year on a proposed mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in which he said, "I don't hold myself out as an expert on Sharia law," he said, "but I have talked a lot about that as a threat." In fact, he issued 177 pages of opinion and talk in September of 2010, which really amounts to an intellectual tour de force designed to scare the pants off of everyone. It's called Sharia, the Threat to America. But even in that 177 pages, there's really nothing that defines Sharia. This is about as close as he comes. I call it submission. Sharia, he said, is a, quote, barbaric, totalitarian political program that masquerades as a religion. Now, who is this guy? He's the founder and president of an outfit called the American Center for Security Policy. He's also a director of something called the Clarion Fund. Now, the Clarion Fund is a very, very shadowy operation that is known for distributing extremely pungent anti-Muslim propaganda movies, and you probably know some of them. Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West. It's full of Nazi-like images, many images of the collapsing trade towers, billows of smoke in New York, children with machine guns, all speaking Arabic, that kind of thing. Another one is the Third Jihad, Radical Islam's Vision for America. Now this one stars a guy named Zuhdi Jasser, who is really the spokesman of the movie and is an actor in it. He also, you may know, was the star anti-Muslim expert witness at Peter King's hearings a week ago today. He's a Clarion Fund advisory board member, as is Gaffney. He's been on Glenn Beck's program many, many times. He had something called the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, which until the last year or so was a very small 2 or 3 person operation in Phoenix. Jasser, by the way, has absolutely no credentials in policy or Islamic studies or political science. He's a doctor. He's also strongly promoted the claim that you see everywhere on the right wing, that a single document written by a single member of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1991 proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that American Muslim charities and advocacy groups are part of a plot to subvert the Constitution and America and install an Islamic theocracy. One document over 20 years ago. And there's been no evidence that anyone other than this guy who wrote it, paid any attention to it whatsoever until 2007, when the federal prosecutors introduced it in a case against an Islamic charity, the Holy Land Foundation. Now, Clarion, the Clarion Fund that we mentioned, is closely allied with an organization called Aisha Torah, which is an orthodox, deeply pro-Israeli organization. It's probably best known for sending American students free of charge to Israel to see the country and to learn about why Israel is good. The organization's funding is very, very murky. However, we do know that $17 million came in a donation from a guy named Barry Said, who made his money manufacturing computer power strips. There's a lot of money in computer power strips. But he didn't give the money directly to Clarion Fund. He gave it through an organization called Donors Capital Trust, which is essentially a money laundering, donor-driven operation. You give your money to Donors Trust. You tell them what you want done with it. Then they give it in their name to whomever it is you've designated. So Barry Said's money went to Donors Trust, Capital Trust. They then transferred it to Clarion Fund. Now, there's a number of things interesting about this aside from the money laundering aspect of it. It does seem like money laundering to me. He denies giving this money to Clarion, which technically is correct because he gave it to Donors Capital Trust. But you may be aware, his name does appear inadvertently, I might add, on a Clarion Fund 990, which is an IRS tax form. Big mistake. The problem is that both Clarion and Donors Capital are 501c3s. 501c3s are nonprofit tax-oriented tax organizations. And one of the regulations involving their behavior is you may not engage in overt partisan political activities. However, Clarion's movies, Obsession in particular, were distributed en masse in Pennsylvania and other swing states during the last election cycle. They came in my own newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer. They came in direct mail. And they were clearly an effort to influence the 2008 election. Obama won this election anyway, but nonetheless, it would appear anyway that the IRS, there's enough information there for the IRS to investigate further in the activities of these organizations. But back to Gaffney. Now, Gaffney is a guy who came of age first with working under Richard Pearl, who's a prominent neoconservative, for a former Senator, Henry Jackson. But he quickly moved with Pearl to the Reagan Defense Department, where he made he cut his teeth. After Reagan's departure, Gaffney founded his Center for Security Policy. And immediately, when Obama came along, he found his métier. For instance, he attacked the appointment of Elena Kagan to the Supreme Court as part of a clandestine plot to institute Sharia law in the United States. The evidence, he said, is clear. Kagan was allied with Saudi, quote, Sharia recruitment efforts at Harvard. She personally officiated in 2003 over the establishment of an Islamic finance project at the law school. The project's purpose is to promote what is better known as Sharia-compliant finance by enlisting in its service some of the nation's most promising law students. Now, Islamic finance is a growing part of international financial law. You can't do business internationally without understanding the vicissitudes of Islamic finance. No interest. How do you deal with that? It's important for attorneys, for financial advisors, for anyone involved in finance to understand how Islamic finance works. But in Gaffney's mind, that equates to the promotion of Sharia law. It's almost as if Kagan was put on the Supreme Court to begin to promote Taliban-style justice. Gaffney's also a birther. Now, you may know what birthers are. He said, another question yet to be resolved is whether Mr. Obama is a natural-born citizen of the United States, a prerequisite pursuant to the U.S. Constitution. There's evidence Mr. Obama was born in Kenya rather than, as he claims, Hawaii. There's also a birth certificate that anyone on the internet can see. He says there's a registration document for a school in Indonesia where Obama studied for 4 years, on which he was identified not only as a Muslim, but as an Indonesian. If correct, the latter could give rise to another potential problem with respect to his eligibility to be president. After Obama gave his speech in Cairo, in which he offered a fig leaf to the Arab world, it seems a long time ago, it was really only a year and a half, there is mounting evidence, Gaffney said, that the president not only identifies with Muslims, but actually may still be one himself. Barack Hussein Obama would have to be considered America's first Muslim president. Are we beginning to get a sense of conspiracy in high places perceived by analysts on the far right? When asked by NBC host David Schuster and Mother Jones's David Korn for proof of Obama's supposed willingness to submit to Sharia, Gaffney pointed to a secret code. Codes are very important to Gaffney. A secret code Obama is using, which apparently only he, Al-Qaeda, the Saudis, and the Taliban understand. David Korn says, where in that speech does he say we're going to submit to anybody? To which Gaffney replied, I think what he is using is code. When he uses the word respect in the context of a waist bow to the king of Saudi Arabia, for example, and talks about respectful language, which is code for those who adhere to Sharia, that we will submit to Sharia. We will submit to the kind of program. Now, Gaffney also believes that people who practice Sharia or use it in any way should be arrested and prosecuted for sedition. He said on a television show that was moderated by Bridget Gabriel, of all people. Now, I'm not going to get into Bridget Gabriel, but she is a Maronite Christian from Lebanon who is virulently anti-Muslim. She's virulently anti-religion in general. She asks him about Sharia law as a religious practice. Gaffney says, it's the law of the land in Saudi Arabia and Iran, and anyone who thinks that what life is like in either of those two countries is the same, anyone who thinks that what life is like in either of those countries is the same as life in America obviously doesn't know anything about Saudi Arabia or Iran. In fact, it is absolutely antithetical. Sharia is, to our Constitution, far from being a protected religious practice. It is an impermissible act of sedition which has to be prosecuted under our Constitution. He goes way out there. I mean, he sees Obama had a redesign for the missile defense logo, which Gaffney saw as a secret coded message about Obama's plans to submit America to Islam and the rule of Sharia law. And he said this, Team Obama's anti-missile initiatives are not simply acts of unilateral disarmament of the sort to be expected from an Alinsky acolyte. Saul Alinsky was a community activist in Chicago. They seem to fit an increasingly obvious and worrying pattern of official U.S. submission to Islam and the theo-political legal program the latter's authorities call Sharia. Now, you notice in all of this, there is no definition of what Sharia is. None. Except that it's very, very bad and needs to be avoided at all costs, and that the President of the United States is a secret purveyor of Sharia law, a secret submitter to the King of Saudi Arabia. Now, funding for Gaffney comes from a number of typical sources, including the Scaife people, Carthage, which is also a Scaife foundation. Interestingly, he also is funded by the Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation. Now, Harry Bradley was a founder, along with Fred Koch, who was the father of the Koch industry brothers, of the John Birch Society. And what we see here is that the organizational and financial roots of this anti-Muslim Islamophobic campaign are very, very, very deep. They go back really to the end of the Second World War and have been consolidating really. I mean, Reagan's election consolidated a lot of this stuff. A lot of money flowed into think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute. They churn out policy papers. The policy papers inform Congress. And all of this stuff is now coalescing in a great ball. In the wake of the King hearings, Gaffney did offer this definition of Sharia, and he brought in some other elements of America's problems, namely the shadowy Muslim Brotherhood, which you may have heard of, and the nefarious civil rights group, the Council on American Islamic Relations. He said after the King's hearings, "Why hasn't the Council on American Islamic Relations been prosecuted for being tied to Hamas, for working on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood, and specifically for fostering the efforts to bring Sharia to America? After all, Sharia is a seditious ideology and totalitarian program explicitly designed to hollow out and ultimately to destroy representative government and the civil liberties that are enshrined in our Constitution. There is every reason for such a prosecution to go forward, and we need to know why it has not happened to date." The idea of the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a civil rights organization, as a tool of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is at the moment working in partnership with a number of other groups to establish democracy in Egypt for the first time in many, many years, is startling, to say the least. But what you have here is the underpinning of this whole idea of stealth jihad. It's really insidious. Stealth jihad is something that cannot be disproven, but it's posited on the idea that there is no such thing as a moderate Muslim. Moderate Muslims do not exist. An appearance of moderation is in fact a lie. It's a mask. It's an effort to deceive, to lull. The people who are moderates, therefore, really in this mindset, are the people who are the most dangerous of all. This attitude is really what was really behind King's hearings and King's views. I mean, you may recall that he said many times leading up to those hearings that 80 to 85% of the mosques in the United States are run by radicals and are in fact hotbeds of radicals. There's no evidence of any of this. The FBI says there's no evidence. He's maintained in the past that there are too many mosques in the United States. He was way out in front in the attacks on the Lower Manhattan Islamic Cultural Center, the Park 51 Cordoba House initiative. He said that Rauf was somehow tied to Osama bin Laden, or he didn't say it, he implied it. And the construction of the center was somehow related to the 9/11 attacks. Peter King said, in a house of worship, it's a house of worship, but we're at war with Al-Qaeda. I think the 9/11 families have a right to know where the funding comes from. So I think they are significant questions. He is by association tying that mosque to Al-Qaeda. He's tying Rauf to bin Laden. He is denying the fact that that Rauf, Imam Rauf, who was the leader of the mosque effort at that time, was in fact someone who was working to build bridges between faiths, to show the moderate face of Islam, to promote the message of the United States abroad, as he had done many times at the exhortation of the State Department. That controversy last summer really was a turning point in some ways. Frank Gaffney weighed in again. He said the Cultural Center was a durable symbolic taunt by our enemies about their bloody victory, which is designed to be a permanent, in-our-face beachhead for Sharia, a platform for inspiring the triumphalist ambitions of the faithful and eroding resistance to their demands for separate and, for the moment at least, equal treatment in America. The Gaffneys of the world really weren't, the Gaffneys of the world provided the language that was brought into the mainstream by the politicians who picked up on the mosque controversy and used it to further their own campaigns in 2010. For instance, Sharron Angle running against Harry Reid. Now, a lot of these were not successful, but some of them were. Sharron Angle was not successful, but she told a crowd of supporters that the country needs to address the militant terrorist situation that had allowed Islamic religious law to take hold in some American cities. My thoughts are these, she said. First of all, Dearborn, Michigan, and Frankfurt, Texas, these hotbeds, are on American soil and under constitutional law, not Sharia law. And I don't know how that happened in the United States. It seems to me that there's something fundamentally wrong with allowing a foreign system of law to even take hold in any municipality or government situation in our United States. You know, one of the problems with the Oklahoma ban on Sharia was the fact that it totally wiped out the efforts of Native Americans to apply their own law in U.S. courts. So it eliminated the possibility of canon law being used in U.S. courts. It destroyed the possibility of Jewish law being used in U.S. courts. There's no logic to any of this. But it does move people. There was a Pew poll that was conducted just about 3 weeks ago, in which 42% said that Islam doesn't encourage violence more than other religions. But 40% said that it does. 18% didn't know. What's interesting to me about that is that in March of 2002, which was right after 9/11, really, 51% of people said Islam does not encourage violence any more than any other religion, and only 25% said that it did. There's been a lot of talk about violent Islam since then. There have been very few incidents, really, but a lot of talk, and that talk has begun to change people's views. I can tell you it's fueled the Tea Party movement. It's been manipulated by the right wing of largely the Republican Party. It's talk that is that's xenophobic and very dangerous. Republicans who identify themselves as conservatives believe Islam encourages violence more than other religions by 66% to 21%. Tea Party advocates believe Islam encourages violence by a margin of 67% to 24%. Those are really startling figures. 3/4 of the Republican Party believes that Islam is a religion of violence. The Republican Party is one of two major political parties in this country. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the King hearings, and I hope there are going to be some questions, or I may read a little bit of the book just to make a point. But I'd just like to note a couple of things. First of all, there were a few witnesses who had initially been floated as participating who were knocked down. One of them, and it gives you some notion of what may have ultimately been the purpose of these hearings. The first person was Hirsi Ali, who's, you may be familiar with her. She wrote a harrowing book called Infidel about her childhood growing up in Somalia and what she went through. She believes there's no such thing as a moderate Muslim. She believes that Islam compels genital mutilation and that it condones slavery. She said, she told Neil Conan on NPR, "Today in the world we live in, slavery is practiced only in the Arab Islamic world. Muslims are not responding to that." But, you know, the facts, of course, are a little bit different. There are probably more than 200,000 women and girls, a quarter of all women trafficked globally, are smuggled out of Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics every year. The bulk of them end up, where do you think they end up? Where do you think they end up? Do they end up in Islamic countries? They end up right here in the United States. There was another witness, a guy named Walid Faris. He was knocked down as well. He was because people don't know who these folks are. Faris was, Marwan probably knows Faris. He was a commander of Lebanese Forces militia, a militia that was deeply implicated in the massacre of the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in 1982. He's since left that part of the world and now I think is attached to a university in Florida, and I've forgotten, I'm sorry, maybe you know. Do you know? A university in Florida where he is considered a terrorism expert, one of the many who've gotten on that gravy train. He's also a fellow at something called the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is a $3 or $4 million neoconservative think tank that features many names that you'd recognize. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, anti-Muslim activist these days as he revs up for the presidential campaign. James Woolsey, former head of the CIA, extremely conservative. And Frank Gaffney, also a fellow there. This is another organization that's been involved in providing funding for advertising and partisan political campaigns in violation of 501c3 regulations. No investigation by the IRS. There was a 2003, I came across this, it's interesting, a 2003 investigative report in the American Conservative magazine. Put the budget at that time at $3 million. It said that the organization relied on support of 27 individual high-end donors, including Leonard Abramson of U.S. Healthcare, New York financier Michael Steinhardt, Edgar S. Bronfman Sr., Seagrams. He's also, I think, president of the World Jewish Congress. Charles Bronfman, Lynn Schusterman, widow of an oil executive in Oklahoma. A lot of money coming from very deep-pocketed right-wing donors. Well, these guys were knocked out. Faris was knocked out. Hirsi Ali was knocked out. That left Zahudi Jasser of Clarion Fund to pick up the anti-Muslim expert slack for the King hearings. There were also, I don't know if anyone saw these hearings or parts of them, there were two family members who were related to terrorists who spoke largely anecdotically about their experiences, and a very interesting guy, the LA Sheriff Lee Baca, who, in my view anyway, was the one person who brought a little bit of reality into these hearings. He was his view was that he had good relations with the Muslim organizations. He worked at it. He had perfectly decent relationship with CARE, and he thought the best way to establish strong anti-terrorism effort was to include Muslims at the table rather than to demonize them. There were two major areas that were absolutely excluded from these hearings that I thought was unconscionable. The first was there was not one single word mentioned about the fact that at this moment the U.S. military is engaged in two foreign wars directed at Middle Eastern countries, one obviously in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, spilling regularly into Pakistan, excuse me. There have also been actions in Somalia, military actions in Yemen, not a word. And what's interesting about this is aside from just being simply astonished by it, if you look at what those people who've been charged with and convicted with terrorism in recent times, what they've actually said about their motivations, you find no reference to something like Sharia or the third jihad or any of this other nonsense. What you find is a guy like Faisal Shahzad, who was the guy who was the Pakistani who was arrested for the bungled Times Square SUV bombing last year. Najibullah Zazi, who sought to buy up healthcare products and create a bomb that he would then place in the Herald Square subway station and blow it up. The soldier Nidal Hassan, who went ballistic and shot 13 of his fellow soldiers at Fort Hood. Every single one of these people has mentioned as the primary motivating force or the single most important aspect of their thinking civilian deaths caused by U.S. military actions in the Middle East. Whether it was Shahzad, who was extremely upset by innocent civilians being killed by U.S. drone flights along the Afghan-Pakistan border, to Hassan, who was very, very upset by what he saw happening in Afghanistan and was deeply, I would say, psychotically worried about being deployed there himself. You would think that what these guys actually said would have some meaning to a congressional committee that's actually investigating supposedly the causes of terrorism in this country. Yet not one single word was mentioned. The second issue, which was mentioned but only in the sense that people were upset that it wasn't the subject of the hearing, and that is that the hearing was narrowly focused on the radicalization of Muslims in America. King repeatedly dismissed these concerns. Several members wanted the hearing broadened to look at extremism of all kinds, which I personally thought was
significant, particularly in the wake of the shootings in Tucson of Gabriel Giffords and many other people, by Jared Lochner, who has expressed deep suspicion of the government. That left 6 people dead, 12 people wounded. It has not been labeled a terrorist act. And Jared Lochner has not been labeled a terrorist. He is a troubled individual. The day before Peter King's hearings, a guy named Kevin William Harpham was arrested in Washington State and charged with hiding a backpack bomb in the Martin Luther King Day parade route. Not one word was said about this at the Peter King hearings on terrorism. In fact, in his statement at the hearing, this just flabbergasts me. King said, quote, "Not one terror-related case in the last 2 years involved neo-Nazis or other domestic groups." As the Southern Poverty Law Center has pointed out, shortly after announcing that hate groups have now topped 1,000 in this country for the first time in their history, Kevin Harpham was a former member of the Neo-Nazi National Alliance. This is the largest neo-Nazi organization in the country. He was well known to investigators and authorities in this area for his rantings about race war and blacks. On the day of the hearing, state and federal law enforcement officials arrested 5 people in Alaska, charging them to plot to kidnap and kill a local judge and state troopers. State police said they discovered extensive plans to carry out these attacks and added that those arrested had carried out extensive surveillance of the homes of 2 troopers. Those arrested included Francis Cox, the head of the Alaska Peacemakers Militia, an anti-government patriot group, not mentioned by Representative King. In just the last 2 years, and this is my own very informal count, incidents involving violent extremists on the far right have left 19 dead and 26 wounded. In Pittsburgh, 3 cops who believed they were lured to a spot were shot and killed by a guy named Richard Poplowski, who's a white supremacist who was afraid that Obama was going to take away his gun rights. In Okaloosa County, Florida, 2 officers slain April 2009 by a guy named Joshua Cartwright, whose abused wife, I might add, told cops that her husband believed that the U.S. government was conspiring against him, that he was severely disturbed that Barack Obama had been elected president. A conspiracy so immense. At the Pentagon, anti-government conspiracist, another one, John Patrick Bettel, wounded 2 police officers in March of last year and who was then shot to death. At the Holocaust Museum, James von Braun, a white supremacist, was gunned down after shooting security guards. The Gifford situation, which also left a federal judge dead. The churches offer no sanctuary. George Tillers killed by Scott Roeder as he was ushering in a church service in Wichita in 2009. In an attack in Knoxville, which left 2 dead and 6 injured in July of that year. At the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church, while 25 children were performing Annie Jr., Jim David Atkinson, who said he hated Democrats, saw the church as part of the liberal secular movement, and was also, I might add, a fan of Sean Hannity's. Took a shotgun out of his case and opened fire and killed at least 2 people. Killed 2 people, wounded 25. Another guy, in January 2009, neo-Nazi Keith Luke stormed a synagogue. He wanted to kill as many Jews, blacks, and Hispanics as humanly possible. In his rampage, he reportedly murdered 2 Hispanics, raped and wounded a third, before, near the synagogue, he was wrestled to the ground by ordinary citizens. Since the Oklahoma City bombing, 25 law enforcement officers have been killed by white supremacists, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. This undercuts the entire premise of the King's hearings. And I think with the exception of the Martin Luther King bombing, not a single one of these incidents has been labeled a terrorist incident. Not even, there was a guy in Maine, Belfast, Maine, 2 years ago, who was building a dirty bomb when he was killed by his wife. He was a neo-Nazi. Not even that incident is labeled a terrorist incident. None of these efforts were said to involve weapons of mass destruction. Not even a dirty bomb, which he was going to use to blow up Obama. All of these incidents were not carried out by terrorists, but by troubled white men. 48 incidents out of 120 in the last, since 9/11, have been reported by Muslims. That doesn't sound like a lack of cooperation to me. In the face of the kind of Islamophobia that is just spreading virulently around the country, that sounds like people who really have a commitment to this country. So, who are the real boogeymen? Is Congress serious about addressing extremist violence? But if it is, it's got to take a hard look at who's going into the gun shops, who's attending neo-Nazi rallies, who's seeking to exploit economic uncertainties and racial fears, because ultimately now, the challenges faced by this country, the challenges posed by extremist violence, are rooted in fear. As far as Muslim violence is concerned, and I'd agree it's a serious but a small threat, we need to ensure that Muslim communities feel they have a political stake in the society. We need to enforce civil rights laws. We need to listen to Sheriff Lee Baca and bring all communities, including the Muslim community, to the table. Because the far right has a big, well-funded voice, and its policy apparatus and propaganda machine are in high gear. It's absolutely essential that falsehoods are confronted and knocked down immediately, which was a axiom in the Clinton White House. If anybody's seen the movie The War Room, they're always out there looking for stuff that they can knock down right away, so that it doesn't get legs. Lastly, and maybe even most importantly, the U.S. has to end its militaristic adventures in the Middle East, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. These are doable things. These are not pie in the sky. These are not impossibilities. They are doable. They're doable right now. But what was lacking is the will to do them. And somehow we have to, reach deep down and find it. Or otherwise, I personally think this stuff is on the verge. It's like those nuclear reactors out there in Japan. It's verging on, out of control. So I want to thank you. I at 7 o'clock.
We've got 15, we got a couple more minutes.
I'm happy to answer any questions about anything.
Questions? First, thank you. And the floor is open. Any questions? Someone's got to have a question.
Anybody see the King hearings?
Well, I'll make a question/statement. It was really interesting that in 2000, when leading up to the Bush election, and this is the irony, is that there was an attempt by conservative Republicans to bring the Muslim community in their fold. And it was a very well organized, financed campaign by Grover Norquist is very much behind it. I don't know if people know.
Gaffney hates Grover.
Grover Norquist he's married to a Palestinian woman, but he's head of the Americans Against Tax or something like that. But you can make the argument that it was a very smart move. Muslims in America are conservatives, mostly conservative socially, and being not all, in fact, most Muslims in America are African Americans. But if you're looking at immigrant Muslims, they're mostly small businessmen or businessmen and women. So they kind of fit the quote-unquote Republican mold, and they were very successful. In 2000, 70% of identifying Muslims voted for George Bush, and a lot of people say that the effort that Muslim American groups did, especially in Florida, was responsible for George Bush's victory. So you have that on one side, and now on the other hand, now what's the percentage of Muslims who are voting for or identifies Republicans? I think it's like 10% or something like that. What do you see with that? Is this I mean, it's not really a question, but
you've suffered 10 years of attacks. And where are the attacks coming from? I mean, one of the aspects, interestingly, of the Ground Zero Mosque controversy was the attacks started coming largely from the Republican right wing, but they weren't the only ones. You know, moderate Democrats, Harry Reid, got in there and say, well, we believe in freedom of religion in this country, but it's the sensitivity of the thing. Now, this was a building that was blocks away from Ground Zero. It was around the corner. You couldn't see Ground Zero from it. There was already a mosque functioning in the building. It was a completely hyped situation by largely thanks to the organizations run by and funded by Rupert Murdoch, who owns the New York Post, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, who plastered this all over the page and all over the front page, and gave a platform for people like Pamela Geller, who's an extreme bigot, who, along with a guy named Robert Spencer, started an organization called Stop the Islamization of America, which the Southern Poverty Law Center has now put on its list of hate groups in America, along with the neo-Nazi groups that most resemble the Geller group. But this sense of, well, we're not really opposing the construction of the mosque. We just think that it's somehow insensitive, and therefore move it, gave the moderate Democrats the best of two worlds, they thought. Now, the fact that the families of the actual families of 9/11 victims, there are three major organizations. One of them, run by an extreme right-wing woman named Debbie Burlingame, opposed the construction of the mosque. She's an affiliate of Liz Cheney, daughter of Dick. But the two other groups, one of them did not take a position on the mosque, although most of its members actually supported construction of the mosque in the location that the imam wanted to build it in. And the other organization, in fact, did support the construction of the mosque. So what was playing there was really, I think, politicians, Democratic politicians following the Republican lead outside of New York City were trying to use this issue as a way to gain support among their own constituents who really knew nothing about it.
Well, I'll ask another one since I got you all here. You do know there was last September 11th, the 9th anniversary, there was a whole attempt to do the Quran burning and so forth. And then Governor Rendell had he was really upset with them and held a interfaith hearing or talk at Independence Hall. And one thing he brought up was that there was a mosque in the World Trade Center on the top floor right by the Windows of the World, in the Windows of the World restaurant that a lot of the employees who were Muslim, who all died, would use to pray. The question is, how bad is the 10th anniversary of 9/11 going to be? Can you?
Well, it's interesting to me that the response to the King hearings has been very low-key. And I think one of the reasons for that, maybe the primary reason for that, is that Cairo, what has happened in the streets of Cairo and other areas in the Middle East, no matter what ultimately happens in Libya, has shown everyone that there is another way, that the idea of democracy, the idea of freedom is not something that's anathema to Muslims, and it's not the idea of terrorism as being the only road toward ridding their countries of these despots. I think has suffered a severe blow. So to me, the real story going forward is really what happens in Egypt.
If there are no more questions, why don't we can talk amongst each other. Stephan's going to be here. There's food and drink. I know a lot of people would like to take advantage of that, so please do. But again, thank you very much, and you're available to sign the book.
I'd love to sign the book.